In 1757, France staged one of the most gruesome public executions ever witnessed. Robert François d'Amiens, a former servant, was convicted of attempting to assassinate King Louis XV after stabbing him with a penknife. Though the wound barely injured the monarch, the act was deemed regicide, a crime so grave that it demanded a punishment of unimaginable cruelty. His execution was meant not just to kill, but to terrify an entire nation. On March 28, thousands gathered at the Place de Grève in Paris to watch the spectacle unfold. Damien was stripped and shackled, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, before boiling oil and molten lead were poured into the wounds. His screams echoed through the square, but the torment was far from over. The executioners then tied his arms and legs to 4 horses, each pulling in opposite directions. For nearly an hour, the horses strained, but could not tear him apart. The crowd grew restless as the executioners used knives to slice through the tendons and joints, helping the animals complete the task. When his limbs were finally ripped from his body, his torso was cast into a roaring fire. Witnesses described the stench of burning flesh and the collective horror that swept through the square. The death of Damiens marked the end of France's medieval methods of punishment. His execution shocked even the monarchy it sought to defend, becoming a symbol of the brutality of unchecked power. Historians later wrote that this moment was the last of its kind, where justice and cruelty became indistinguishable. In 258 AD, during the reign of Emperor Valerian, Saint Lawrence of Rome met one of the most infamous deaths in Christian history. As a deacon, he was ordered to surrender the church's wealth to the Roman Empire. Instead, Lawrence distributed it among the poor and returned to the emperor saying, "These are the true treasures of the church." His act of defiance sealed his fate and transformed him into a symbol of courage. Lawrence's execution was designed for spectacle. He was bound to a massive iron grill placed over burning coals, his flesh seared slowly as onlookers watched in disbelief. Yet even as the flames consumed him, Lawrence remained calm. According to legend, he mocked his torturers with a chilling jest, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." The bystanders were torn between awe and horror as the saint's body blackened under the heat. His faith appeared unbreakable, even in the face of unbearable pain. For many witnesses, the scene became proof of divine strength, overpowering earthly cruelty. St. Lawrence's death became a cornerstone of early Christian martyrdom. His composure amid suffering inspired centuries of believers and secured his place among the most venerated saints. In the end, the fire meant to silence him made his voice eternal. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was one of the chief architects of England's Protestant Reformation. Serving under King Henry VIII, he helped establish the Church of England and its break from Rome. But when the Catholic Queen Mary I rose to power in 1553, Cranmer's reforms became his death sentence. The once powerful archbishop was branded a heretic and imprisoned for treason against the faith. For over 2 years, Cranmer endured psychological torment in confinement. Under pressure, he signed recantations, renouncing his Protestant beliefs, hoping for mercy. But when brought to St. Mary's Church in Oxford to make a public confession in 1556, he did the unthinkable. Standing before the crowd, he denounced his earlier recantations as lies and reaffirmed his faith in the Reformation. The declaration sealed his fate. Cranmer was dragged to the stake and bound tightly as the flames rose around him. In a shocking display of repentance, he thrust his right hand, the one that had signed his false confession, directly into the fire, declaring, "This hand hath offended." Witnesses said he held it there until it was completely consumed. Thomas Cranmer's death became one of the defining moments of Tudor history. His courage and defiance of both fear and pain made him a martyr for faith and conviction. Even in death, his final gesture symbolized a victory of conscience over the cruelty of the age. In Renaissance Florence, Girolamo Savonarola rose from a humble friar to one of the most feared men in Italy. Charismatic and uncompromising, he denounced the corruption of the church and the excesses of Florence's elite. For a time, his sermons turned the city into a theocracy, where books, art, and luxury were condemned as sins. But power breeds enemies, and soon, the church decided he had gone too far. In 1498, Pope Alexander VI excommunicated Savonarola, branding him a heretic. Crowds that once adored him turned violent when papal forces arrived. He was arrested, tortured on the rack, and forced to confess to false charges. On May 23, 1498, Savonarola and 2 of his followers were led to Florence's Piazza della Signoria. Before a massive crowd, they were stripped of their priestly garments and hanged from a wooden platform. As their bodies swung lifelessly, the executioners lit the pyre below, consuming them in flames. The square filled with smoke, and the air reeked of burnt flesh and incense. Savonarola's ashes were scattered in the river Arno to prevent his followers from venerating him. Yet his death only strengthened his legend. To some, he was a mad prophet undone by pride. To others, a martyr who dared to speak truth to power. In 1610, Paris became the stage for one of the most horrifying executions in European history. François Ravaillac, a Catholic fanatic, had assassinated King Henry IV of France, stabbing him to death in his royal carriage. His motive, a twisted belief that the king was betraying the church, turned him into both a murderer and a symbol of fanaticism. The punishment that awaited him was designed to erase his very existence. Ravaillac was first interrogated for days, his flesh crushed with red-hot pincers as he refused to name accomplices. Then came his public execution at the Place de Grève before thousands of spectators. His body was tortured piece by piece, boiling oil poured into his wounds, melted lead dripped onto his chest, and his right hand, the one that held the knife, burned to ashes. The pain seemed endless. Finally, 4 horses were tied to his limbs, pulling in opposite directions. When the ropes snapped, executioners cut through muscle and bone to finish the job. His remains were burned, his ashes scattered, and even his family was banished from France. Witnesses fainted, others vomited, but none forgot the horror they had seen. The death of Ravaillac was meant to restore royal order, but instead it exposed the depths of human cruelty. His execution echoed across Europe as the last flicker of medieval barbarity in a modern age. The man who killed a king became a symbol of the brutality kings could unleash in return. Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, was a Scottish nobleman whose life was steeped in intrigue and rebellion. In 1746, he joined the Jacobite Rising, supporting Bonnie Prince Charlie's failed attempt to reclaim the British throne. After the defeat at Culloden, Fraser was captured and charged with treason. His punishment would be one of the last public beheadings in British history, and one of the most humiliating. On April 9, 1747, thousands gathered at Tower Hill in London to witness his execution. Ever the trickster, Fraser joked with the crowd, even as he mounted the scaffold. But fate turned grimly ironic when the viewing stand collapsed under the weight of onlookers, killing several people instantly. The axe fell cleanly, severing his head in one stroke. His body was left on display, a final warning to Scotland's rebels. Yet even in death, Fraser's gallows humor lived on, his laughter haunting the very system that sought to silence him. The Tower's silence that day felt less like justice and more like mockery. Simon Fraser's execution closed the curtain on an age of rebellion and spectacle. His defiance, wit, and violent end made him both villain and legend in equal measure. To some he was a traitor, to others the last free spirit of a dying cause. In 1435, the quiet waters of the Danube hid a royal scandal that would end in tragedy. Agnes Bernauer, the beautiful daughter of an Augsburg barber, had captured the heart of Duke Albert of Bavaria. Their love defied the rigid social order of medieval Europe, where noble blood was sacred and commoners were disposable. To the Bavarian court, Agnes was not a bride, she was a threat to royal lineage. When Albert's father, Duke Ernest, discovered the secret marriage, he was furious. Seeing his son's union as a disgrace, he ordered Agnes arrested while Albert was away. On October 12th, she was taken to the banks of the Danube, bound in chains, and condemned without trial. Witnesses described her praying softly as she was thrown into the water, the current closing over her as if swallowing a secret. The execution shocked even the hardened nobles of Bavaria. Duke Albert returned too late, his grief turning into rage and rebellion against his father, but power prevailed, and her name was buried alongside her body. The Danube, they said, carried her soul away in silence. Agnes Bernauer's death became a legend of forbidden love and cruelty. In later centuries, poets and playwrights would immortalize her as Bavaria's doomed commoner queen, a woman destroyed by the arrogance of birth and the brutality of politics. Roger Mortimer's rise was as dramatic as his fall. A powerful English nobleman and soldier, he became the lover of Queen Isabella, wife of King Edward II. Together, they led a rebellion that overthrew the king in 1326, with Mortimer ruling England as the Queen's de facto partner. But his ambition and arrogance soon made him enemies, and whispers of betrayal filled the court. When young Edward III came of age, he acted swiftly to reclaim his throne. In 1330, Mortimer was seized in a daring night raid at Nottingham Castle. He was dragged before Parliament, accused of treason, murder, and corruption, all without a fair trial. His pleas for mercy went unheard, and his former lover, the Queen, could do nothing to save him. On November 29, 1330, Mortimer was led to the gallows at Tyburn. He was hanged like a common criminal, his once proud face pale beneath the noose. The crowd fell silent as his body swayed in the cold wind. The man who once ruled England, reduced to a cautionary corpse. His lands and titles were stripped, his name cursed as a traitor. Yet history would remember Mortimer differently. To some, he was the Queen's doomed lover, a man destroyed not by treason, but by the ruthless balance of power. His death marked the end of an era when passion and politics collided in blood. In 1546, Anne Askew, a young English poet and Protestant preacher, became one of the most famous martyrs of the Reformation. Intelligent and outspoken, she publicly challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, an act considered treasonous under King Henry VIII's rule. Arrested for heresy, she refused to recant her beliefs, even when threatened with death. Her courage in defiance of tyranny made her a symbol of faith. Anne was taken to the Tower of London, where she faced the rack, a device designed to tear the body apart. She was stretched until her joints dislocated, her screams echoing through the stone chamber. Even in agony, she refused to betray her fellow reformers. When her interrogators demanded names, she replied, "I came not hither to recant, but to witness the truth." Too broken to walk, she was carried to Smithfield for execution. Bound to the stake, she prayed aloud as flames engulfed her body. The crowd watched in stunned silence as her composure never faltered, even as fire consumed her. Her final words were said to be a psalm, whispered through smoke and flame. Anne Askew's death became a rallying cry for Protestants across England. Her story exposed the savagery of religious persecution and the unbreakable strength of conviction. In the centuries that followed, her name would be remembered not for her suffering, but for her unyielding courage. In 1012, England was ravaged by Viking raids, and among the countless victims stood Archbishop Alfege of Canterbury. Captured during a brutal siege, he refused to let his people pay the ransom demanded by his captors. For months, he was held prisoner, beaten, and mocked for his faith. His defiance enraged the Vikings and sealed his fate. On April 19th, during a drunken feast in Greenwich, his captors dragged him out before the crowd. They hurled bones, stones, and even ox skulls at him, laughing as he prayed for their forgiveness. Finally, one warrior struck him in the head with an axe, ending his suffering. The drunken laughter turned to silence as his blood stained the ground. Even his killers were struck by remorse, burying him with honor after realizing the holiness of the man they had murdered. The English Church canonized him as a martyr, the first Archbishop of Canterbury to die for his faith. His death became a symbol of courage and conviction amid savagery. For generations, Alfege's story reminded England of the cost of mercy and resistance. His martyrdom stood as proof that even in an age of brutality, compassion could triumph over fear. The church bells of Canterbury still ring for him, a saint who forgave even those who took his life. In the summer of 1381, the peasants' revolt had swept across the country, fueled by anger over taxes and social injustice. At its heart stood John Ball, a defiant priest who preached equality, asking, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" His words stirred thousands of peasants to rise against the ruling elite, and for that, he was marked for death. After the revolt collapsed, Ball was captured near Coventry. He was brought to London in chains, where King Richard II ordered his execution, as a warning to all who dared challenge authority. On July 15th, he was dragged through the streets to St. Albans, jeered at by the same people who had once cheered his defiance. His punishment was to be an example, the full horror of medieval justice. He was hanged until near death, then cut down to face worse torment. The executioner sliced open his abdomen, tore out his organs, and burned them before his eyes. Finally, his body was quartered, his head displayed on London Bridge as a message to the commoners. The crowd, silenced by terror, watched as hope was butchered on the scaffold. John Ball's execution ended a dream of equality centuries ahead of its time. Yet his words lived on, whispered in secret by those who still believed in justice. History remembers him not as a traitor, but as a martyr for the powerless, a priest who dared to speak truth to kings. In May 1541, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, met one of the most gruesome executions in Tudor England. At 70 years old, she was accused of treason against King Henry VIII, a charge steeped in political revenge rather than truth. Margaret was a cousin of the king and mother to Reginald Pole, a Catholic cardinal who had opposed Henry's break from Rome. Her royal blood made her both dangerous and expendable. On the morning of her execution at the Tower of London, Margaret refused to kneel before the block. The inexperienced executioner hesitated, unsure how to proceed. When he finally swung the axe, he missed, not once, but several times, hacking at her head and shoulders as she screamed and struggled. It took more than 10 blows before she died. The crowd recoiled in horror as her blood soaked the straw beneath the scaffold. Even hardened soldiers turned away from the butchery. The executioner was said to have been trembling and pale, his face twisted in shame. Margaret Pole's death became infamous as one of the darkest moments in Henry VIII's reign. Her brutal killing was seen not as justice, but as a massacre ordered by fear. Centuries later, she was declared a martyr by the Catholic Church, her final stand remembered as both tragic and defiant. The medieval world was a time when faith, fear, and power collided, and death was a performance for kings and crowds alike. From nobles torn apart by horses to heretics burned alive for their beliefs, each story is a reflection of humanity's darkest instincts. These weren't just punishments, they were warnings written in blood, meant to control, terrify, and silence. If you found this journey into the most inhumane deaths of medieval times haunting yet fascinating, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts below. And if you want to uncover more forgotten horrors and hidden truths from history, make sure to subscribe. Because sometimes, the past is darker than we ever imagined.